We've been telling you about a powerful witness today for George Zimmerman's defense, a nationally renowned forensic pathologist and expert on gunshot wounds. In cross-examination, the prosecutor was respectful of Dr. Vincent DiMaio while zeroing in on all the things he couldn't know for sure about the shooting. He also asked Dr. DiMaio about Zimmerman's claim that Trayvon Martin, put his hand over his mouth and nose during their scuffle.
That's where he's got blood there, right?
Right.
Okay. I put my hand over that, right?
Okay. Yes.
What do you expect my hand to have on it?
Blood.
Sir, wouldn't you agree that that photograph I just showed you that I put my hand over, and you said you would expect blood in my hand, wouldn't you agree that if he was bleeding like that, that the blood, if he's standing, the blood will go down, right? I'm assuming. If he's bleeding from the nose?
It depends how quickly, but eventually will go down, right?
Okay. Now, if I'm laying flat on my back and I'm bleeding from my nose, the blood will go inward, correct?
Partially.
Right?
Some will go out and some will go in.
And so it will be more difficult for me to swallow or to speak, I'm assuming, if blood's coming down, correct?
Depends how profusely you bleed.
Sure.
Right.
Okay. Well, assuming I was bleeding profusely, I'm assuming I had a bloody nose or maybe even a fractured nose, and it was bloody, and I'm laying down, the blood would go into my mouth, correct, eventually?
Yes, sir.
And let's bring back our panel, Jose Baez, Sonny Hostin, Gene Casares. Gene, give us your analysis of what we just heard, because this was part of the cross-examination, the effort to undermine a little bit what Dr. DiMaio was saying on behalf of the defense.
And undermine the credibility of George Zimmerman, that George Zimmerman was lying when he said that Trayvon was putting his hand on his mouth as he was screaming for help. No blood was found on Trayvon's hand. And another expert has testified that possibly when he was laying down, George Zimmerman, that the blood would be going down his throat. It wouldn't be coming out of his mouth because of the force of gravity at that point. So the prosecution trying to show with the witness that, in fact, the blood could come out of his nose.
Sonny, what's your analysis?
You know, I thought that was okay cross-examination. I don't know that the prosecution got that much out of it. Like Gene, I think they got out of it that perhaps George Zimmerman was lying when he said he was the one screaming for help, because you can't really scream for help if you've got blood in your throat. But I think what was good for the prosecution is that the defense is trying to have it both ways, Wolf. They're trying to say, one, well, you know, his nose was so bloody because Trayvon Martin punched him in the nose, and they're also saying that Trayvon Martin covered his face with his hands, his nose and mouth with his hands, causing him not to be able to breathe. Well, if that's true, they're sort of mutually exclusive, right? You can't really yell for help and also, you know, say that somebody covered your mouth and there's no blood evidence on that person's hand. So I think it was helpful to show the inconsistencies in George Zimmerman's voice, but I don't know, testimony rather, but I don't know if it was that helpful.
And let me get Jose to weigh in. Go ahead, Jose.
Well, I think to piggyback off of what Sonny's saying, if you add on the fact that was he also screaming for help if he had his hands covered, but also how could you be banging his head and still covering his mouth? So if he's banging his head and covering his mouth, it's kind of difficult to do something like that while you're trying to cover someone's mouth up. But if later on, if the state wants to, they could show DNA swabs from Trayvon Martin's hands to show whether there was actual DNA from George Zimmerman on his hands. I don't know if that's coming, but certainly if they have it, that's the time to use
already.
it. Okay.
And that has come in already, Jose. That has come in already, that there was none of George Zimmerman's DNA under Trayvon Martin's fingernails. On either hand, there was no blood found on Trayvon Martin's hands.
But that's not what I'm talking about.
That's not what did that in its state case in chief.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the swabs of his hands, not the fingernails or the search for blood. That's completely different. If his hands were actually swabbed for DNA, and they are not George Zimmerman's DNA, that's the time the state should use it. So that may come.
But
we don't know yet.
Here's the challenge. Here's the challenge, according to with his out on that grass for 3 hours that night as it was raining before it was taken to the medical examiner's office.
But it doesn't matter. It would just degrade the DNA. It wouldn't get rid of it altogether.
Right.
You can have bodies submerged in water and still obtain DNA from it. It would degrade it, but it wouldn't get rid of it altogether.
I think the medical examiner testified, who did the autopsy, that he didn't see anything on the hands or on any blood or anything. As a result, he didn't do any DNA there, and that was seen, at least by some, as negligence on the part of the medical examiner. But we'll talk about this. Hold on for a moment, guys. I also want to alert our viewers we're standing by.